Welcome to the Movement Upgraded podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jen Hassler, licensed physical therapist and certified strength and mobility coach. Here you can expect to hear about all things movement. The Movement Upgraded podcast is a blend of the science of strength training, rehab, and mobility, mixed with the personal and professional experience to provide you with the steps you need to keep your body pain-free and moving well, so you can do what you love forever. Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. We're going to talk about one of my favorite topics to talk about, cars. So I've talked about them a lot on and off in the podcast. I talk about them all the time. I've kind of gotten down a little bit of an explanation of them, but I figured it would be really helpful to have a resource where we talk about what they are and what to really think about when we're doing cars and like why I'm so annoying about doing them. And just kind of give you the lowdown on them. So if you have not heard of, you're not aware of them, this is the episode for you. So CARS stands for Controlled Articular Rotations. It's not just this random acronym or word. It's literally an acronym for some anatomical jargon, basically. So controlled because we want to do these in a controlled manner. They're very intentional. I'll talk about that today. Articular is just the fancy term for a joint. It's where two bones meet. And I like to remind everybody that the point of a joint is movement. If we did not need movement, if movement was not important at that place, then we would not have two joints meeting. It would have just been one long bone fused. So we need to move joints to keep them healthy. So articular just means joint. It means where two bones articulate or come together. And then rotation, because most of our joints are shaped in a circular type of shape, for lack of a better word. They are very round. And so when we are trying to move the joint, move one bone on the other, it should really mimic and mirror the shape that the joint is. And I think one of the cool things, if you're a super movement nerd, which I know a handful of you are listening to this, looking at the anatomy of a joint that you're wanting to work on. So maybe if you're looking at your shoulder or looking at your hip, it's really interesting because you can kind of see the movement that's happening when you're doing a car. And I like it because it really gives me a good picture on, it's like what I literally think of when I'm doing my cars, like my hip cars or my elbow cars. And so you can kind of see how the movement really mirrors what the actual joint looks like, and most of them are round, and so that's why rotation. A lot of people will call these joint circles, but there's like a running joke in the FRC community, which is where this came from, that people kind of like bastardize cars into joint circles, and it's just these like high speed, low intention movements, and they're ending up moving everything with them, and they're not getting as much out of them as they would if they just approach them as cars. I talk about cars all the time. If I were to have created a daily movement routine to keep you healthy, I remember back in physical therapy school, we got broken up into groups, and then we got assigned topics, and we had to come up with whatever the topic was. And our topic was creating an assessment for like joint wellness, right? Like wellness, what would that look like? And at the end of the day, we were like, you should basically just look at every single joint head to toe and measure the ranges of motion and strength basically at those joints, which is funny because that's what FRC, it basically came up with the FR system did. And if I would have came up with a basic like tool or routine for people, it would have looked like cars. So I didn't invent cars. I don't claim anything about it. I just spread information about it because why reinvent the wheel if something has already been created that's amazing? So that's how I feel. That's what cars are, and that's where they came from, is the FRS community. Specifically, Dr. Andrea Ospina Dre, he came up with the FRS system, which is where FRC comes from and a lot of what I've talked about. So that is functional range conditioning if you want to look that up on the internet. But basically, I'm going to give you the more layperson jargon information about this rather than all of the extreme science information. So I like to consider myself as a translator for this type of stuff. So that's what cars are. A lot of our family and friends like make jokes about it, and we'll be like, anytime they complain, they'll be like, my neck is hurting, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, did you do your cars? Like, you know that that's what you need to do. And if you're not doing those, that's step number one. So I don't even entertain questions from most of my close family and friends. I just teach them cars. And then if they're not doing them, I just tell them that's what you need to do. Because the bottom line is it's how we feel in our bodies and taking care of our joints really come down to our habits, just like everything else. And if you're annoyed at me from saying that already, I am annoyed at saying that. But it is just kind of the way it is. That's the byproduct of how we achieve results in any way, shape, or form. It's just an accumulation of habits, and cars is that low-hanging fruit of a habit for taking care of our joints that if you're not doing it, I can't magically create some system or some exercise program that's going to address things if you're not doing the main one in the first place. So do your cars, and then we'll talk from there. That's what I usually tell my clients, or my patients. I mean, I do tell them that, but I met family members. I'm a little bit less cut and dry with patients and clients. But my family will often say, yeah, I did my trucks or whatever. I did my boats. Like, they make jokes out of it, but that's kind of like the running idea. So what controlled articular rotations really are is just moving each joint through its full range of motion, head to toe. It's a daily movement routine where you can check in with your body. And the way I like to explain it is just the blushing. We're really doing great with words today, huh? It's the brushing and flossing of your joints. So dentists have been really good at teaching us how to take care of our teeth, right? We've got to brush our teeth. We have to floss them every day because life happens and an entropy shows up and our teeth get plaque buildup and all kinds of stuff. And that is what brushing and flossing do. It helps remove that, so we don't need dentist as much, or we don't it mitigates our future risk of dental disease and all of that type of stuff, like cavities. Of course, we can't prevent everything because of genetics and all those other things with our teeth. It's the same thing with our bodies. We just need to make sure we are doing the basic daily habits that we can to take care of our joints. That is what cars is. So the reason we do cars, or what they help, are going to be, number one, joint health. Our blood carries our nutrients, right? So if you were to take a joint supplement like chondroitin or something else, collagen, you would get into your bloodstream, hopefully, and the blood would then carry that to your joints, right? But our actual joint, the joint space, doesn't have blood flow that goes inside of it. And nutrients have to pass the barrier to get in and out of a joint. And the way that happens is through a pressure gradient through movement. And if we are not moving the entire joint, if we are not loading, like pressing, pushing, our joint is not like articulating at a certain place, or it's not getting offloaded, so it's always kind of compressed, both things are important, then those nutrients are never getting into that joint. So you can take all the supplements you want, and it's never going to get into the joint or get into the joint area that is the problem, especially if we are lacking range of motion. So very often, the problem area is lacking range of motion. We're not able to either offload or we're not able to load that area, and because we can't reach it, or it's constantly being reached, but we can't like decompress it, essentially, then we are not getting nutrients in and out of that. So that is why cars are so important, because we are going to expose you to ranges of motion you don't normally do in your daily life. Very often I'll work with people and they'll be like, I don't know why I've lost all this range of motion. I'm like, well, when's the last time you did a movement like this? Like, when's the last time you reached your arm all the way back, right, as far as you can? Or there's certain movements we do, like we have to scratch our back, or we're like randomly won't be able to do it, and we're never able to do it, but we never do it or try to do it on a regular basis. So why would we expect to be able to do that? Our body's not going to randomly be like, yeah, I'm going to maintain all these ranges of motion. Like, that's kind of energy costly, and our brain's goal is to minimize how much energy expenditure it's doing, because that's how we stayed alive. That's literally like a primitive response to keeping us alive. So we want to expend as little energy as possible. And by we, I mean like our nervous system, like our primal brains. And so we are not going to maintain range of motion. We are going to lose that as we get older if we are not telling our body we want to keep it, which is what cars are doing. So it'll help you keep your joint healthy. It maintains your range of motion. It actually decreases your pain sensitivity and tightness. So a little bit, it also improves your body awareness and control. And when we do that, we can downregulate how much tightness and stiffness we experience. And every day our brain is upregulating or downregulating our nociceptors based on how much pain-free movement we're doing. So if we're not doing a lot of pain-free movement at that joint, we are more likely to have a lower pain threshold. So we might feel or experience more pain or higher degrees of pain just because we're not moving regularly. So those are all things that our cars are doing. Also decreasing fibrosis. I like to think of that as like the plaque buildup on our teeth. So we're decreasing that. We're keeping those tissues nice and pliable and healthy. It's also a really amazing way to check in with your body. If you have a body issue, if you have a joint issue, we've got to have a good connection and communication with our bodies and pay attention to what our bodies are telling us. On a regular basis, our body is constantly telling us information. We're just not paying attention. And sometimes when that information is not being paid attention to, and it's information that's saying, hey, maybe change something, whatever, that information will become louder and louder and louder until we can't ignore it anymore. And very often that is what happens when I work with people. They will have some nagging thing that they didn't pay attention to, and it started out as like maybe a little loss of range of motion, maybe a little stiffness, maybe a little nagging thing here and there. And then it gets to this point where it's so significant they can't ignore it anymore. When in reality, when they look back at it, they're like, oh yeah, I guess I have had some weird signs here. I just didn't really pay attention to it. Well, we didn't pay attention because we're so busy in our normal daily lives. What if we just took a couple minutes to check in with our bodies and how much better that would feel? And so that is what cars do. Also, when we're doing cars, the way that I explain them, we really are being super intentional about doing them. And when my clients work with me, they're like, oh my gosh, I can't think of anything else because they're so hard, right? It's not that they're really that difficult. It's our intention, right? So it's how we make them. I can go through a shoulder car and make it super easy and not intentional. I'll probably move other parts of my body, which is not ideal. It's not what we're trying to do in a car. So we want to make sure we are super intentional. And when we're doing that, we're being very mindful. We live lives like outside our bodies. We aren't paying attention to things. There's just stuff going around all the time. If we can take a few minutes and be a little bit mindful, super duper present, it's almost like a form of meditation. And that is another reason I love cars. Now, sometimes we're just going to get them done. We're going to be checked out. We're just moving our body. That's totally fine. But the more often we can kind of come back to, let's be really mindful and present for 5 to 10 minutes while we're doing those daily cars routine. It has a lot more profound effects on how we feel, not just because we're moving our joints, but because we're present and mindful in a world that is basically set up for us to be the opposite. But being present and mindful throughout the day is actually really, really key in just feeling good and having overall health and wellness in our bodies. So that is what cars are doing for us. The how do we implement cars is going to be what I want to talk about next. So there's definitely different uses for cars, and that's kind of what I want to get into next. We have cars for like our daily movement routine, like I'm explaining, but cars can also be a training tool. So we can use them as like strength training. Today, I'm not focusing on that. I'm actually just going to focus on it as a daily routine because that's what most people need to use them as. Using them as a training tool is advanced. And unless you've been really consistent with cars for a while, we probably don't need to use them as a training tool. And I also have an episode talking about using cars as a warm-up for your lift. I think I believe it's called Uncomplicating Your Warm-Up. Check that out if you want to learn about how to use cars for your warm-up for your workouts. But when it comes to like implementing cars on a daily basis, it's really important just to get them in sometime during the day. It doesn't matter what time. The time that matters really is just what you can be most consistent with. But I have found very often that I will do them throughout the day, or I just kind of get them in whenever I can. And I've also found that sometimes it's really helpful to be a little bit more like stringent, like strict, and be like, I'm going to do my coffee and cars every morning, and kind of get those in. And so it's really just dependent. And my routine and the way that I approach them, it changes all the time. I am not somebody who's big on obsessive routines, I like to have a little flexibility depending on how I feel, because sometimes I like to actually spend my morning time journaling a little bit rather than working on my cars. So it just really depends on what your goal is, but definitely just do them when you can. And they don't all have to be done at once. You can break them up and do movement snack breaks, right, throughout the day. That's totally fine as well. Just get them in, right? Remind your body, remind those joints they exist and you want those ranges of motion. The difference in between a morning routine and using cars as a training tool has to do with intensity. And one of the simplest ways that we can modify how intense cars feel is through a concept called irradiation. So if you've never heard of irradiation, it's something that I teach, and a lot of people in the strength field will teach people to learn how to do, because it's really important to learn how to generate tension proactively. That's how I like to explain it, rather than reactively. So when we go to lift heavy weights, we want to generate some form of tension, which we usually do by the principle of irradiation, so that we can kind of own the weight. And then when we lift, the things that move are going to be the things that we want to move, rather than not generating tension before a lift. When we go to actually lift the weights, we're kind of floppy all over and we have to like reactively respond, and that tends to feed into more compensations. That's not necessarily a bad thing, just depends on what your goal is, but most of the time we want to be more proactive in learning how to own the weight, own the movement, and own the exercise we're doing through control. And that starts with irradiation. So irradiation, the best way I can explain it, the way I teach people, is I want you to take your arm right now as you're listening, and I want you to squeeze your fist. Just squeeze your fist a little bit. You should feel your hand muscles squeeze a little bit, maybe your forearm. I want you to squeeze a little harder. Now you're gonna feel your forearm muscles squeeze a little bit. Now I want you to squeeze harder. You're gonna feel your elbow muscles come into play. Squeeze even harder. You're gonna feel your shoulder girdle a little bit, maybe some of your lats. Squeeze even harder. You're gonna now feel some of your abs engage in your core. Now squeeze even harder and you might feel the rest of your body. Your neck's engaged, everything's nice and squeezed and tight. That concept is called irradiation. So as you're squeezing harder at a higher intensity, more irradiation, you're going to include more of your body. This is called like internal strength. This is like internal force generation. When we are doing cars, we are going to do some form of internal force generation. For our daily routine, we want to keep that at about 10 to 20%. If you are doing a PR for like a deadlift, you're going to be at 100%, right? You're going to be really taxing your nervous system, squeezing everything. So for a daily movement routine, we want that 10 to 20%, maybe even less, to just kind of have this be a really calm, intentional, slow movement. That way we're not squeezing and creating a lot of tension. When we do things like training and we do warm up, we just do a higher percent of irradiation, or sometimes we add loads or bands, things like that. That is where the difference is. So for today, again, we're focusing on that daily routine. So we want a very minimal amount of irradiation created. The thing that I like to make sure that people understand is when we first start doing cars, it is one joint that is moving at a time. Now, when you're first learning, you probably have no idea exactly what that is, and that's okay. You're not a movement expert. I don't expect that. I am still learning how to be a movement expert, right? So but I've done this for a very long time. I've analyzed a lot of movement. It's what I do every single day, day in, day out. I've worked with a lot of bodies. So I'm gonna know when you're moving one joint versus the other a lot better than you, but that doesn't mean you can't learn. And I really want people to become a movement expert of their own bodies, because it's your body, right? Like it's your one body you're given for your whole life. So it makes sense that we should start to get to know it a little bit better. And that's really what a cars practice is. It's just a body practice where you get to talk to your body and communicate with it and listen to the things that it's trying to tell you and what things feel like. And so when we first start doing them, it's one joint at a time, right? So we might start with our neck. We should only see our neck moving or only try to move our neck. A lot of people don't know what this looks like, so I very often will have people start with a mirror or recording themselves so they can see. But when I have people do things, a lot of the mistakes they make immediately will be trying to make their movement bigger, right? I don't want big movements. I actually want small movements at the beginning because I want them to only be from your neck. So when I work with people, eventually we always want to be reaching for a little bit more range of motion, right? If we are limited in our range of motion, we're really trying to get our control, we should be kind of seeking out those end ranges. But we can't do that until we can own our articulation first and only move that one spot. So when you're moving your shoulder blade, we're not going to sit there and try to squeeze for a little more range of motion and find those outer edges of our ranges of motion until we can really isolate a shoulder blade without your spine moving with it, right? We're not aiming for perfection here, by the way, because I work with a lot of high performing people. And sometimes that means we start to look for, okay, but I'm not doing it right. It's right versus wrong. And there's no right versus wrong. It's a long, big spectrum. We're really just working on 1% better every day. And we're just trying to do our best. And sometimes our best looks different, right? Situational best, right? During that situation, we want to make sure that we are doing the best we can given our current environment and situation. So we want intentional movement first. So we just want to make sure that the movement is coming. So we really just want it to be super duper intentional. And like we want to just be thinking about what we're doing rather than just kind of getting through the motion. Sometimes this does take coaching. So when I work with people, I want you to do the best that you can based off of what your understanding is at that time. I don't expect you to understand what fully shoulder blade movement is versus spine. I just want you to understand based off of where we are in that moment. I usually take several sessions of coaching through these to work with people. And spine, for example, spine cars, especially spine segmentation or segmental cars, they're not like a full car. Spine segmentation is kind of a broken down partial car. But when I work on those with people, it takes years for them to get the hang of it. So just understand, like, this is a new skill. You're not going to be super good at it first, and we really don't want big movements. I think that if you're a performance, high achieving type of person, you're automatically going to be like, I'm going to get an A on this test, right? And you're like, full range of motion as much as I can. But if you don't have the awareness of what your shoulder is versus your spine, as soon as you try to make a bigger movement, our brain's like, I got that. I'm going to make sure your hand can reach as many ranges of motion as possible. So I'm just going to move what I can to do so. And that ends up dumping into your spine, right? And that's just reinforcing your spine as your shoulder. And what we're trying to do with cars is teach you how to have a shoulder and how to have a spine separately. We want things to work separately really well so that they can then play together better. So we want individual ownership first. And the way that I usually will have people progress from here or kind of start is I want you just to pay attention as you're moving what you feel. Sometimes to get people to feel this, I have to have them create a little more irradiation. So this is like maybe if you're normal, if we're moving through air, right? Air is not giving us any resistance. But if we imagine we are moving through peanut butter, now we have a little bit more resistance. It's a little bit thicker. That's, Ali is panting in here. So if you hear him, I'm sorry. There's a thunderstorm right now and he's a little afraid of it. But when we are moving through peanut butter, we're going to squeeze a little bit more so you can kind of be a little bit more aware of what you're feeling. What we want to focus on is two things. Number one, what tissues do you feel doing the movement? What muscles are doing them, right? Then when we are progressing, maybe you can squeeze those muscles a little bit more to get a little bit more range of motion. And maybe you feel some cramping in there. That's totally fine. That's what we're looking for, right? So that's kind of like the next step. The other thing we want to feel is eventually we want to be able to feel a stretch on the opposite side. So when we are moving, if we are rotating our head over our shoulder, so we're going to look over our shoulder, the muscles that are doing that movement on the side that we are moving our face towards should be really kind of squeezing. Those are what should be contracting and doing and producing the movement. Muscles on the opposite side are what we should feel lengthening and stretching, which are going to be, that's how we know we're towards the end of our ranges of motion, right? We should feel a stretch limiting the opposite side. And something I notice working with a lot of people, especially a lot of yogis or people who are very flexible, they'll feel tightness, right? They'll be like, I feel tight. See, when I go into this movement, it's perfectly normal to feel tightness. You should feel tightness on the opposite side. That is a muscle limiting your range of motion and controlling it. So that's normal. And we're trying to seek out stretches as we're doing them. A lot of times when people first learn cars, they're like, they're boring. I don't feel like I'm getting anything out of them. And what you put into them is what you get out of them. And sometimes you don't know what to put into them because you don't have that awareness yet. The second thing is if they're boring, we really need to just kind of have a little bit more intention. We need to feel and try to seek out those sensations I was just talking about, the muscles that are doing the movement and also the muscles that are lengthening or stretching in that movement. And that's what we're trying to seek out. So those might be some examples of how we might progress, right? So like progressing is going to be just reaching for maybe a little bit more in the reps that we're doing just to get a little bit more range of motion. So that's kind of going to be some way to push into that. Now, things we don't want to feel in our cars are going to be pain. Almost always I'll tell people, if you feel pain in your cars, you don't need to not do them, but we need to try to find ranges of motion where we don't feel pain. So just make your movements smaller. And I always will tell people I want smaller movements at first. Once you've mastered the end ranges of motion with either no pain or pinching, or we don't have compensations, then we can start trying for a little bit more range of motion. The other thing we don't want to feel is if I'm turning my head towards my shoulder, and then the side towards my shoulder is called a closing angle, and the side on the opposite side is called an opening angle. We don't ever want to feel closing angle pinching or sensations, because that's a joint kind of coming really close together more often than not. We don't want to push into that. So that is going to be what we want to feel and what we don't want to feel when we're doing them. I talked about irradiation. So you want a slight contraction. You can contract a little bit harder if you really are training them. So if you have like a joint you're really working on, obviously you can do a little higher irradiation, get a little more out of it. But for daily repetitions, we want them to be very chill. And a lot of people ask when, or sorry, not when, but how many we need to do. Honestly, if I had people doing things the way I would want, we would just do cards all day long, like lots of them, because they're just something that are very hard to overdo unless you're creating too much tension in them. So we really, for a bare minimum, we want like 2 to 5 reps at each joint, right? That's maintenance mode. If you have an area that needs more attention, that's really, it's lacked for a while, we haven't addressed it, it's really limited, we're gonna do like 10 plus reps maybe. It's a lot. So think about that as you're going through them. And just know that like more often, cars are going to be better than less often generally, especially if we're abiding by, no pain or pinching, right? So as long as we're abiding by that, you'll be good. One of the most important things that most people can do when they're doing cars, besides understand that this is a lifelong process, you're never going to be perfect at them. We're not seeking perfection. There's that concept, I believe it's a Japanese term called kodawari. It's the constant pursuit of perfection, knowing that it doesn't exist. So we're just 1% better every day is what we're trying to get. We're just trying to get better at our bodies and nourish them, right? And just connect with them. If that is what we're really focusing on, then we can do nothing but improve, right? But one of the things that I have a lot of people do when they start with cars, besides adjust their expectations and mindset, that's a long-term process, is record themselves. And I will sometimes record my patients or clients in the office because I want them to see what I'm seeing and try to see what's actually happening versus what they think is happening. And that visual is so helpful, especially for the spine, because we can't see our spine moving when we're doing it. Every other joint, we can usually kind of get some visual integration, which is part of our ability to know where our body is in space. Our vision's important for that. While we're trying to improve our proprioception, which is knowing where our body is without our vision, sometimes it helps to have our vision there. So when we don't have that, a video can be really helpful. It's also really helpful to have a video because then you have like here's what I looked like when I first started, and you can actually see the progress, because we are terrible at recognizing our progress, short-term and long-term. All of myself, my clients, everybody I know is just not the best at it, right? So sometimes having that objective data to prove to ourselves we have had good progress is really helpful. Now, you're not a movement expert, I already said this, so you're not going to know exactly what you're seeing, but you can definitely start to see some things here and there, and it can be really helpful to kind of understand what you think is happening versus what's actually happening. I have found it super, super helpful, and I was somebody who hated and never wanted to record myself. I didn't like myself on camera. I know that's ironic coming from somebody who's on social media a lot, and I'm also on a podcast very often, but I was not always this way. In fact, actually in undergrad, I had like anxiety attacks before every speech I had to give in speech class. So we can all make improvements on pretty much any skill that you would ever want to. And it's just a matter of practice and intention and practice and intention, right? So recording yourself can be really important in beginning to understand what's actually happening versus what you think is happening. So that would be my biggest tip for anybody who is doing this. Also, just know that like, you're not gonna do these every day. I want you to, right? And you want yourself to, but you're gonna have days where you just like don't do them. And if you want to be successful with cars and mobility work, just know that you're going to start over a lot, and you're going to end up coming back to them often. And you're going to have days where you don't do them, and you just start again, right? You just literally start again the next day, and it's not even a thing. think there's like a concept, ain't no thing but a chicken wing or something. I don't know. But that's what I want you to be thinking about, is just understand that like people who are successful are typically the people who are most okay with starting over and over again. It's just like relentless. Like I'm going to end up stopping and I'm going to get a little frustrated with myself. That's okay, because a little frustration often is what fuels some change. We just don't want to add shame into that. So we want to kind of remove those emotions, check what's been happening. Why did that happen? Can I make improvements, or am I going to make peace with how I handled the situation? Those are your options. And then from there, just get back to it, because that's what matters the most. So hopefully that was helpful in understanding cars a little bit and how to implement them. If it was and you want to tell me about it, love to hear from you. If you think there's somebody who would benefit from this, please feel free to share it to them. And if you loved this episode and you haven't left a review, I would be so thankful for you to hit that 5 stars and drop me a note on the review. It is the best way to support me and support the content that I'm sharing here. So I so appreciate that. But with that being said, I will chat with you in the next episode.